to introduce Professor Stephen Williams, who has been Professor of Systematic Theology at Union Theological College in Belfast since 1994. He studied modern history at Oxford and theology at Cambridge and gained his doctorate through the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Yale. From 1980 to 91, he was Professor of Theology at United Presbyterian Theological College in Aberystwyth, which is in his home country of Wales, and then was at the Whitfield Institute in Oxford before moving to Belfast. Stephen has very wide interests, and he's at the moment writing a commentary on Romans with the New Testament scholar Howard Marshall. He's been very concerned since his doctoral studies with questions of religious epistemology, and that feeds into the science-religion debate. He has a particular interest in John Locke. So, without further ado, let me hand you over.
Rodney has made known to you what I like to make known at a fairly early stage, which is that I'm a Welshman. And this, therefore, provincial bickering which went on earlier about England and Scotland. I'm also teaching in Northern Ireland, but it's the Welshman in me that's responding here. Of course, gets under my skin considerably, because I hope that everyone here is a devotee of the King James Version of the Bible, the Authorized Version, where it says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, God made great whales. And on that point, I'm extremely traditional in my preference for Bible translations. Although you may think the spelling leaves something to be desired. I'm aware in conversing with many of you, as I was glad to do last night and get to know some of you, I'm well aware that there's quite a range here, quite a diversity of backgrounds. So hopefully what I have to say will in parts be useful and interesting to everybody, but I don't think anybody will find the whole of it useful or interesting because of the diversity. I always particularly like the question times and then the more informal discussion times that happen afterwards. Nevertheless, in looking at this question of science, faith and reason, let me launch out in the hope that what I have to say will hit the mark for many people much of the time. Now, you have your handouts now, I think. They've all gone round. I just have very few images up here on the screen. I want you to begin point one with a remark about popular perceptions, and this will not come as news to anyone. But, and I was conversing with someone about this just now over coffee, for many people, as you know, there is a perception that we are looking at a distinction, indeed conflict. On the one hand, there is science and reason. On the other, faith and religion. Any distinctions I want to make between faith and religion are ones I shall make a little later. But it's deeply ingrained in people's way of thinking. It's an unquestioning assumption that this is the way the distinction goes. Science and reason on the one hand, faith and religion on the other. And I suppose if you wanted to put it in a slightly more formal way, for many people, scientific endeavor and scientific reasoning, as the word reasoning suggests, is a species of reason. That when people of faith or religion speak about science and set themselves in some sort of relationship to science, what they're doing is setting themselves in some sort of relationship to reason. The underlying issue, if you want to think about the relation of science and faith, is really the relation of reason and faith. Scientific thinking being the paradigmatic way of rational thinking. That, is it not, is a widespread modern perception. And I want to think a bit about that over the course of the next few minutes. Now, someone might say, point two, that the price I pay for being a Welshman and living in Northern Ireland is that I know nothing about postmodernity. I've set it up in a modern way. But as a matter of fact, public rhetoric, public political rhetoric, seems to presuppose the modern rather than postmodern scene. If by postmodernity we mean a way of thinking that react against modernity as well as traditional religious positions. If a postmodern is someone who refuses the hegemony or the sway of reason, as well as refusing any kind of authoritative role to religious belief, if a postmodern person is such a person, then which politician speaks in a postmodern way? Politicians all talk as though there are moral standards. It's wrong to have poverty, wrong to have torture. We must eradicate X, Y, Z. That's a thoroughly modernist way of thinking. Now, I don't want to speak for the scientific community or communities, because naturally there'll be a great variety here. But my impression is, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, as someone who actually has more to do very often with people and humanities than the scientist side, my impression is that postmodernity cuts less ice very often in scientific circles than in circles of the humanities. Not always, I know. But nevertheless, in my experience certainly, limited as it's bound to have been, I find that the postmodern flag flies less vividly, less visibly over some scientific discussions than does over humanities ones. So I make no apology in any case of starting with a public perception of the distinction, which sounds as if it could come from the Enlightenment, because it does to some extent come from the Enlightenment and also from before. Now, one way in which you could tell the story, point 3, is this. This I take to be a widespread popular way of thinking. 3a, religion belongs essentially to, is constitutive of, is the heart of, primitive worldview. Its language is characteristically mythological. It may appear to be describing the world in objective terms or realistic terms or literal terms, but actually it uses the language of poetry or myth, and people have confused those two kinds of languages, the mythical and literal, all too easily. And in that primitive world, causality is something which you interpret by relationship to God. You don't think in terms of immanent causalities. You don't think in terms of cause and effect operating in scientifically discernible ways. You think rather of God causing X, Y, Z. And that for many people loosely is how the primitive worldview works, with religion at the heart of it. By way of contrast, 3b, we've had the coming of a scientific enlightenment at some point in the history, particularly of Europe, as people are familiar with European history. I'm thinking here of popular perceptions. Scientific enlightenment has come about, and we think of all these things differently. Language is used in a precise sense, an objective sense, often a literal sense, even if metaphors are used in science. Causality is interpreted in terms of what can be empirically shown to be the case, the cause and effect we all think of and talk about naturally. That has a scientific kind of root to it. And as for God, well, God is a perhaps. There may be God. God appears at the margins here, a kind of separate question for many people, though not for all people, of course. Excuse me, something's slightly catching my throat, so I may be clearing it a little in these first few minutes. I don't know what it is. Now, 3c, putting it all together, it's not simply that science and reason belong together on the one hand, faith and religion on the other, but also somehow, in a vague sense for many people, science, reason and democracy all seem to go together. It's as though democracy, in its way, spells the legitimacy or proper place of science and reason. In a democracy, you can appeal to rational and scientific considerations. In democracy, you can't publicly appeal so well to religious considerations and faith considerations. So political structures like democracy, or the political structure of democracy, naturally allies itself with science and reason. That, I think, is a widespread public perception. And needs to be challenged. I can't spend much time challenging it explicitly this morning, but it certainly needs to be challenged. I'll be, in certain ways, challenging it, certainly in the early stages here of what I have to say. So, point 4, all I want to do is conclude here. The relation of science to faith is perceived to be an example of the relation of reason to faith. Faith or religion is at best a matter of opinion, at worst a damaging superstition. If we were dealing only here with private opinion, when we deal with faith and religion, well, that might not be too bad, because, you know, there are silly people around and you ought to tolerate silly people. But it's worse. In terms of the atheist or new atheist attack on religion or Christianity in particular, religion is more than an intellectual folly. It is a socially very damaging force. It is a damaging superstition. So that the intellectual credentials of religion and the social cultural place of religion, those things are associated in people's thinking, and that means that for many people religion and faith is on the defensive in a secular, liberal democracy which lauds science and reason, which permits religion graciously to exist, but that's as far as it goes. Now you tell me if you think that is a caricature. But tell me after the lecture, not in the middle of it. Though I'm not particularly averse to people interrupting, still it might be easier to keep to the format of discussion afterwards. Now let's tell the story a little more carefully here. And I'm going to be very sketchy here, point 5, because later today I think we have someone speaking about the Middle Ages. So let me just make 5 comments, 5A to E here. Let's pause to see something, however sketchily, of what happened. A, Christianity was born into a philosophical world. I don't mean, of course, that the world was entirely philosophical, but it is born into a world where there were philosophical systems stemming from Greece and from Rome. And Christianity itself was not a philosophy. It might have philosophical implications, but that's precisely what the early Christians had to ask themselves. Does it have? If so, what kind of philosophical implications? How do you relate as a, let's call it for a moment, without comment, religious movement or faith movement, how do you relate to philosophical currents? And you had in the early Christian centuries, as many of you will know, a whole gamut of responses to this. There were those who were rather negative towards philosophy, that religion and its impulse has little to do with philosophy. It has to do with Jesus Christ, in the case of Christianity, and the salvation of the human soul. And what has philosophical wisdom to do with that? It confounds the wisdom of this world. On the other hand, you had those who believed strongly that it was the responsibility of Christians to think through the philosophical dimensions of their faith, to articulate them, to explicate them, and also indeed to challenge prevalent philosophies. In other words, there was a philosophical agenda there for Christians to pursue, rightly so, even if Christianity was not itself a philosophy. You had therefore a range of views, often very positive in attitude to philosophy in the early Christian centuries. 5b. When the question of Islam arose earlier, and I can't pretend to be expert in this either, but when Islam arose and developed and spread in many geographical directions, Muslim thinkers found themselves encountering, as Christians had, the work of philosophers from the ancient world, notably Aristotle. Aristotle's works were available in the West, some of them, but not really many, and they're available there to be read by Western thinkers, but Muslim thinkers took a particular interest, some of them took a particular interest in translating Aristotle from Greek into Arabic, and sometimes via the Syriac as well, and they came then into the Western European world too, because it became of interest to Christians that the work of Aristotle was being received and interpreted and thought about by Muslims. I'm oversimplifying here, of course, but Jews, Christians and Muslims in the Middle Ages were very often concerned with a common set of problems. as a matter of fact. And the obvious outstanding one, to which we refer here, is the fact that in Aristotle you have a system of thought which does not rely on or stem from religious authority. Now that might be all right if Aristotle ended up saying the same things as the Quran did, or as the Bible did, but what if he doesn't? What if, for example, the Quran is clear that God created the world? What if Aristotle is by no means clear on that at all, that there was a creation at a point of time? On the contrary, what if there are reasons in Aristotelian philosophy to question that? What if Aristotle is shaky on the immortality of the soul? I say shaky because there are texts in Aristotle which talk about the immortality of the soul, but for the most part it seems to be denied, and certainly thought about in ways different from the way in which Muslims or Christians might naturally think of the way in which post-mortem life continues. So what do you do in Aristotle? Well, if you're a philosopher and a devout Muslim, what you're going to say is, well, from a philosophical standpoint, certain theses about the creation of the world and immortality of the soul, from a philosophical standpoint, they look very suspect and highly improbable. But, however, we are religious people, so we believe these things. By the way, I think, putting my hand in my pocket, I think I've forgotten to switch this on. Oh. You've all been able to hear me, I hope, right? Or do I start all over again? Sorry about that to Zoe or whoever it was who gave me this. Now, you have a situation there for developing where you might, as a religious philosopher, say that one thing tends to be the case when you think philosophically about it, but from the standpoint of religious belief, you hold something different. Okay, that's very crude and very rough, of course, but along came Thomas Aquinas, a Christian thinker, not a Muslim thinker, as you'll know. And Thomas was, in the Middle Ages, unhappy with this state of affairs. He wanted to make use of Aristotle and did make use of Aristotle, but Thomas came up with what is sometimes called a synthesis, the Thomistic synthesis. What Thomas said was that we must not put faith and reason at each other's throats. There is kind of harmony here. Now, harmony does not mean that you can figure out rationally all those things which are believed in faith. In faith, you can and should believe that God is Father, Son, and Spirit, Trinity. Now, that's not something you're going to come up with by philosophical investigation, but all that means is that it is above reason to hold that proposition, not that it's contrary to reason. Actually, exercise your reason as far as it can go, and you'll conclude that God exists. So, reason will tell you that God exists, which supports theism and religious belief through philosophy. But I might tell you certain attributes of God too, such as the God cannot change, but it will not go the length of telling you that God is three in one, or that Jesus Christ came to save us, or something of that kind. The synthesis then is one in which there are certain truths above reason, certain truths which the faithful, ordinary people, of course, don't believe them by philosophy, but they can be held philosophically by the philosophically inclined. Knowledge and faith are technically different things as far as Aquinas is concerned. Knowledge has to do with the way in which you acquire certain beliefs. Faith acquires beliefs a different way. But faith is not there by some sort of shaky or second-class opinion. Faith certainly has its assurance. It is simply not technically knowledge because it doesn't figure things out in the way which a philosopher does. Well, you might think all should have been peace and harmony and love after that, and what could be better? But along came some very nasty people and broke up that synthesis of Aquinas's. I don't really mean they were nasty, of course. Whether or not they were nasty, I will leave you to decide if you like. But there were those who came along, religious believers, Christian believers, of course, because of the dominance of Christianity in Europe, who said they were unhappy with this. Effectively, although again one is cutting short a long story, effectively they had less confidence than Thomas had in reason. So that the capacity of reason to discern in matters to do with God is far more limited than Thomas thought it was. And therefore, if you want to maintain certain Christian beliefs, you do so on faith. Reason doesn't cut against those. It is simply operating a rather different sphere where it's not actually able to deliver much in a way of supporting religious beliefs. So it might not cut against, but might not particularly support. And the breakup of the synthesis intellectually is culturally significant because in the 16th century, of course, you had the breakup of Christendom itself, as we call it, that kind of unity of church and society, which we label under the word Christendom, which came to particular dominance in the Middle Ages. And with the Protestant Reformation, or strictly Reformations, because there were several in the 16th century from separate centres, with those you had the breakup of Christendom itself, therefore different forms of Christianity's in official existence, at a time when, to a large extent, it wasn't the only thing going, of course, but to a large extent, the Thomistic synthesis was one which had been breaking up. By the way, Thomas, although looking back he seems to be very influential, he took time to have his influence. He was one of a number of thinkers in the Middle Ages, influential but certainly not the only one. He's had an official position in the Catholic Church much more recently than the Middle Ages, which has given his thought, particular weight. But we mustn't forget he's one of many in that time. Well, you have a kind of deadly combination in some ways. In a way, that's a random image for me to put up, but it's the way I want to be remembered, so I like to have that image. Science skepticism and the Protestant Reformation. Let's say a quick word about the connection here. In the ancient world, there were skeptics, capital S. And the skeptics, some of them said, in relation to knowledge in general, nothing to do with religion in particular, they said, nothing can be known. You would have thought you couldn't get more skeptical than that, but a group of people came along and said, actually, that is too dogmatic. If you say dogmatically, nothing can be known, you're making one dogmatic statement, you're claiming to know one thing. We don't even know if anything can be known or not. Now, that's endless fun if you want to do philosophy. And you might say, well, what is this going to do with science and the Reformation? Well, just in the 16th century, there were texts being republished from those ancient debates. Think of the impact of publishing those texts at a time when Catholics and Protestants were quarrelling. So Catholics say X, Protestants say Y. Well, it's not just one set of Protestants, different sets of Protestants. They all know. They all say the other's wrong. And it occurs to you that maybe the problem is we just don't know the things we think we know. Perhaps we should be a bit more modest about our claims to knowledge. And along come the skeptics, or at least their texts that were published from those days, and really they're a breath of fresh air. Because they suggest that inflated claims to knowledge are causing this problem and breaking Europe apart in bloody conflict and warfare. Now, we know nothing about that in Northern Ireland, of course. But you see my point. I mean, this is very live still in Northern Ireland, one way or the other. So you have a deadly combination because at a time when skeptical texts are being republished and the Protestant Reformations are going on with all the social effect of that, you have the potential of science delivering in certain ways. After all, here's something where you can have, can you not, knowledge, where you can have, can you not, demonstration, where you can have, can you not, observation, and how can you decide in issues of religious controversy? Well, you have the Bible, people interpret it differently, you have the teaching authority of the church. Some people question whether that should be in place at all, or how it should function. But with science, you have something which promises something far better. Now, to some extent, I'm generalizing terribly here, and even having a bit of hindsight, but this is the way things seem to have shaped up, to some extent, as we look now back at the flow of intellectual history. Now, let me move on pretty quickly. Let me just say a word about the myth of opposition between faith and reason, because myth it is. When the 17th century got underway, and I found very, very interesting and helpful Peter Harrison's earlier presentation. When the 17th century got underway, we've heard that leading Christian thinkers, far from substituting science for faith, introduced ways of thought which I want to look at briefly in the case of two people, Pascal and Locke. And I want to do so because they introduced ways of thought which shows us historically how ignorant we can be of how faith and reason and science actually were connected in the early modern period. So those who separate faith and reason systematically and have this general idea that once science arrived, it eventually overthrew religion, need to ponder actually the way in which that some leading thinkers thought through the relation of faith and reason and science. And I want to pause with them for a moment. One is Pascal, and the other is Locke. Now, this is the only point of my lecture which I'm going to be reading a couple of pages. You'll find what I'm reading, by the way, if it's of interest to you. I think it's still up on the web. Christians of Science Ireland put up on the web a lecture I gave on religion and scientific reason. Religion and scientific reason. Dawkins, Locke, and Pascal. And here we are. I have mentioned the name Dawkins. Well, we've got 11:30 before anyone's done that. So. Dawkins, Locke, Pascal, religion and scientific reason. Let me just read briefly extracts from what I say there at the moment about Pascal. Pascal, 1623-1662, was a genius, mathematician, inventor, experimental scientist, not to mention religious thinker. Many of you will know all this. After he had built a calculating machine, he turned his attention to the experiments, here we are, by Torricelli, disciple of Galileo, to figure out how we're to interpret what looks like the empty space that appears when you fill a tube with mercury and suspend it upside down under specified conditions. Now, Pascal, Christian thinker, was insistent that it was the senses and not some logical reason that was to resolve issues about the vacuum. With regard to experimental science, Pascal was occupied with the question of the role of observation in the establishment and confirmation of scientific theory. He emphasized there's a difference between the description of phenomena and the invocation of theoretical causes to explain the phenomena. Where do we draw the line between description and explanation? And how can causes be tested? Those questions accompanied Pascal's experiments on levels of mercury in the Torricelli tube to see whether we can draw conclusions about the existence of a vacuum. You'll see the relevance of all this in a second to the general theme I'm pursuing. Pascal was also occupied with the question of how first principles in scientific and philosophical reasoning are ever known. Geometry expresses the most exact form of reasoning, and its demonstrations are demonstrations par excellence. But if we try to analyze some of the fundamental concepts which enter into geometry, or more broadly, into experimental sciences as well, number, space, time, movement, if you try to analyze those, we find ourselves, Pascal thought, unable to arrive at satisfactory and incontestable definitions. So we seem to do far better at definition and demonstration when it comes to the practice of geometry than when we scrutinize foundational concepts like the concept of number or of space. Now, I've said here Pascal was no fideist. A fideist, roughly, is someone who believes that faith requires no rational foundations, that faith is justified qua faith and requires no rational foundations. Now, such a person is often called a fideist, and Pascal is often being accused of fideism. It's a manifestly false accusation for anyone who actually studies the work of Pascal, looks at the whole of it rather than picking out certain sentences from it. What is interesting about Pascal's reasoning is when he moves outside the particular realm to which I alluded just now, and moves to think more widely about religious epistemology, questions of how we know, why we believe. Pascal emphasizes that if we give reason free rein in investigation and thought, it hits its own limits. The self-limitation of reason is very important for Pascal. I quote him here. These quotations are up in the website essay. One must know when it is right to doubt, to affirm, to submit. Anyone who does otherwise does not understand the force of reason. These quotations are from the Pensées, the thoughts. Reason, as Augustine said, would never submit unless it judged that there are occasions when it ought to submit. There is nothing so consistent with reason as this denial of reason. Reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. It is merely feeble if it does not go so far to realize that. That's a very important epistemological move. This is not a superstitious religious thinker who, clinging on to faith, says, oh no, reason's bad and naughty, can't prove anything. This is Pascal saying, oh, reason itself, when it gets going, actually doesn't get all that far. That's what he wants to say. As a matter of fact, Pascal employs reason, and I shall come back to the theme involved here, though not Pascal himself, later. He employs reason in order to warrant Christian belief as far as he's concerned. He looks at the questions of prophecy, for example, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, we might not think his reasoning convincing, but he attempts to show that Jesus is a Messiah on the basis of rational considerations as far as he's concerned. You know, Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy. And he is adamant that faith certainly tells us what the senses do not. But faith does not say the contrary of what the senses tell us, not the contrary of what they see. Faith is above, but not against reason. He further thinks that scientific and religious knowledge don't work in the same way. And here, the question of the will is important. When people think in purely scientific terms, I'll use that broadly for a moment, for the whole of life, in purely scientific terms, something's missing. That is scientism, whereby one way of approaching certain realities becomes the dominant way of approaching all reality. Now, what does Pascal have to say to that? Well, Pascal says this: the will does not enter into understanding where scientific reason is concerned. Where you're reasoning scientifically, forget the will. It is simply understanding. That is to say, obviously, it can enter into a preliminary stage where motivation is concerned. I can decide that I want or do not want to find out whether there's a vacuum. That might be a matter of my will. I want to know if there's a vacuum. That's the will, yes. I can will to start experimenting to find out if there's a vacuum. But once experiments start, then you can't say, I want this to be the case, or I want that to be the case. You are bound to go where that experiment leads you. That is purely your understanding, says Pascal. That's how it is with science. It's led by understanding in that respect. Science proceeds on the intellectual basis. The truths that Pascal calls natural, known to everyone. But religion works in a different domain. Because religion has to do with the heart. And the heart has a different order from the mind. The heart has certain things that are of interest to it, such as the nature of human greatness or smallness, humility, pride, love. Things that make the world go round, after all. Here the will is involved. In other words, if you want to find out about those things, you've got to be engaged in a certain way. The question of your motives and desires and your heart set up, the way your heart is disposed. Now, it enters into all those things, which doesn't enter into if you're asking about the vacuum. The will has its own first principles, such as the desire to be happy. So out of the desire to be happy, you investigate certain things about human being and pride and humility and all those things. It doesn't operate in scientific work. The Christian faith addresses itself to that dimension of the human person, the dimension which has to do with happiness and the heart and those things. And why should it not? and what is wrong with not proceeding scientifically in that particular area. The way of God, who disposes all things with gentleness, is to instill religion into our minds with reasoned arguments and into our hearts with grace. Reason cannot take you all the way to faith. It can open you up to that domain, but human will and desire and the operation of divine grace then become determining factors once the heart is opened up. Now let me move on to Locke, and don't worry, I'm not going to exceed my time here. I'm going to move on pretty quickly. I'd love to spend longer on Locke, but I won't. Locke was called the intellectual ruler of the 18th century. Massive influence. The one who called him that was Virginia Woolf's father, by the way, Sir Leslie Stephen. The intellectual ruler of the 18th century. The judicious Mr. Locke, as he was known. A mighty figure indeed. Now, in terms of history, philosophy, and philosophy of religion and philosophy of science, Locke is a very, very interesting, not to say significant figure, and in terms of political theory, of course, as well. Hugely influential. How did Locke approach things? Well, again, like Pascal, for all the differences between them, Locke says, let reason have its own way. Let it investigate what it wants to investigate. In all domains of human endeavor, it just will not get very far. He even thought of that for science in a way, by the way, and that's something I could expand on in discussion if you want. His philosophy of science is very interesting here at this point. But what concerns us here is the general question of faith and reason. And Locke said, let reason go, it just won't go very far. It won't conclude very many things definitively. Again, self-limitation. And again, Locke makes a lot of the conceptual distinction between something being contrary to reason, according to reason, and above reason. It is contrary to reason to hold that 4 plus 4 equals 9. And if you say God revealed to you that 4 plus 4 equals 9, whatever that might actually mean, you could ask questions of meaning there. You'd have to say, well, no, God didn't reveal any such thing. You've got to question whether God revealed it rather than subvert 4 plus 4 equals 8. 4 plus 4 equals 8 is according to reason. You don't need God to tell you that at all. But for most things in life, most important things in life, actually you're not able to pronounce. The dead shall be raised. How do you decide on that rationally? Now some people say, of course you can decide on it rationally. Locke actually concluded rationally, whether or not you think it is a good argument, he concluded rationally that God existed. Now, if you conclude that God exists, and then ask the question, are the dead, can the dead be raised? Reason has to say, I don't know, says Locke. Reason has no idea. But what it can do is it can examine the credentials of those people who say they saw a dead person. And if people come along and give testimony, and there are eyewitness accounts, and if you weigh and measure these eyewitness accounts, that is your scientific duty in historical science, as well as natural science, to weigh and measure. If you weigh and measure those things, and if having measured eyewitness accounts, you conclude that at least one person rose from the dead, then you can make it an entirely rational proposition that the dead can be raised. Because your senses have operated, not that they can directly prove that in this case, or even show it to be probable, but they can give credence to the testimony of certain people, and that is a pure, perfectly rational way of proceeding, the only rational way of proceeding. Okay, yes, I did have old Locke out there. Now, I've marked on these because it helps to keep the record straight. I know I've taken some time, perhaps more than I should have on that, but whether or not they were right on science, faith, and reason, I'm going to say that they were not completely right, but I'm going to say at the end I think that they were onto some important things. Nevertheless, I think if we meditate on Pascal and Locke in the present context, starting with my point one about popular perceptions, we begin to think that this business of faith versus reason, not just historically have we not had conflict, but conceptually there may be something very, very wrong with it. I mean, what exactly is wrong with Pascal's reasoning and Locke's reasoning? They should be wheeled out in contemporary debate, even though, as I'll indicate, I'm not entirely with them, and they differ from each other. Now let me say a word, the 7, 8, and 9 quickly, about the three terms we use, science, reason, and faith, because I've gone along happily without saying anything about those. In relation to science, I'm not a philosopher of science. My my training is partly in philosophy of religion, as well as theology, and then history at an early stage. But I can't claim competence in philosophy of science. But I cover these things as a theologian and a philosopher in general. In philosophy of science, there have been, for a long time, in the 20th century, moves away from a simplistic understanding of science as you observe or demonstrate, and then you prove or show probable X, Y, Z. People have thought not simply in terms of demonstration, not even in terms of theories or models, but they've thought in terms of paradigms and falsification. A paradigm, this will be familiar to many of you, but a paradigm is roughly a picture, a conceptual structure of the way you think things are. And then some datum comes in and you might modify the paradigm a bit. Another datum comes in, you might modify it a bit. And then something comes in, you might say, the problem here is that the whole pattern of looking things, of this scientific worldview, is wrong. Let's switch it and have something else instead. Now that's a crude, popular way of looking at it. But it's been emphasized by many people that far from science simply accumulating its evidence, as it were, and going on from one observation to demonstration to another, that there are shifts of worldview which call into question the reliability of any given scientific worldview at any given time. It's being taken that way, certainly, by some people. Falsification. What makes a scientific statement scientific? Well, it's been argued what makes a scientific statement scientific is that it is falsifiable. There are conditions under which it could in principle be falsified. It might not in practice, but you can specify conditions under which it can be shown to be not the case, theoretically. And in practice that may come about too. So again, scientific statements, far from being complete, definitive, final, actually are ones which are falsifiable by their nature as scientific statements. Now this has all been developed in elaborate ways which I've not tracked in detail in my reading in philosophy of science in the 20th century, and it does give one cause to pause. On the one hand, I dare say we would be foolish and mistaken to conclude as a result of these developments of philosophy of science that nothing scientifically can be known. To take it to that skeptical extreme might be very foolish and intellectually unwarranted. On the other hand, developments which have nothing to do with religion in the philosophy of science itself, and I could name the thinkers I have in mind, for those of you who don't know, in the discussion if you like, developments of philosophy of science itself have suggested we could be very careful about assuming the finality of certain scientific worldviews, happily going along and saying, well, science has shown X. Are these things not falsifiable? Well, maybe we could discuss that a little bit more, and those of you who are into these issues might illuminate us all on those questions. Let me say a quick word about reason, point 8. Earlier on, I emphasized the way in which both Pascal and Locke emphasize the limits of reason, but both of them are reckoning with reason as a kind of common and universal quality, ideally. That is, there is such a thing as capital R reason, and all capital R reasonable people, though not all people are reasonable, will think a certain way. Now that, of course, has been challenged by postmodern thought. So a postmodern person might say, or an advocate of postmodern philosophy might say, there are reasons, but no such thing as capital R reason. To say that reason, capital R, prescribes things is kind of imperialism. But quite apart from all that, in some of the big atheistic movements of the 19th century and early 20th century, it was emphasized that reason itself operates under the constraints of certain interests. Far from being rationally neutral in the way we think about the big things of life, as a matter of fact, we are pushed, we are driven, we are motivated. We want certain conclusions to be the case. We're the subject of social circumstances. All those things enter into our thinking, and it's a myth to talk about rational neutrality from that standpoint too. That's just not the way humans tick. So in thinking of science, faith, and reason, we have to put those qualifications on the way people understand the word science and the way they understand the word reason. Thirdly, faith. Point 9. Now, I have talked about Christian faith largely in this session. That is not for one moment to regard as more important to talk about Christianity than other religious convictions. I don't mean that at all, but the present setup in terms of science, faith and reason in the West, of course, derives largely from reaction to Christian faith, although people are beginning to learn more and more about Islam in the Middle Ages, for example, and of course the traditions of Judaism. But if I had my way, I would ban the word religion from discussion. Now, of course, that would mean I couldn't come to Faraday Institute to talk to you, so I'm not going to ban it yet. But the word religion, lazily used in the public sphere, is a mischievous word. I mean, if you ask, what do Zen Buddhism and Upanishadic Hinduism and Islam and Christianity, what exactly do they have in common as religion? You might be quite hard put to it to work out what that was. And here we talk about religious as opposed to secular views. Peter Harrison's own earlier work of many years ago, in Religion and Religions of the English Enlightenment, or some such title, is very, very illuminating and helpful on this. If I therefore confine myself largely to Christianity, it's in part not only because I'm a Christian who knows more about the tradition than other traditions, but it's because in part I do not think you can treat religion generally in relation to science. It depends what you mean by religion. And that has a knock-on effect, of course, on the concept of faith. What faith are we talking about when we talk about faith versus reason or whatever? 10. How do Christians ever come to believe what they do believe? In other words, how are we to think about the epistemological foundations of Christian faith in particular? Now you know why I'm narrowing it to that. How does Christianity stand in relation to this faith-reason debate in a scientific context? A, the knowledge of God, the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures, comes about through the divine word and through alleged events. It is said that God has spoken, it is said that God has done certain things, and they are mutually implicative. That is to say, if God had not spoken, then funny events like the crossing of the Red Sea would be inexplicable. If, on the other hand, God had spoken and nothing happened, like funny events and crossing the Red Sea, then you'd wonder why anyone should believe God had spoken. So that really there is a relationship in the Old Testament between the alleged word of God and certain alleged events. The two of them interlock. 10b. What is significant to me in Christian faith in relation to the New Testament is the emphasis put on testimony and eyewitness, which Locke, for example, tells us, not that we need him to tell us, is actually a perfectly rational place to put your emphasis. Let me just call up this. This is the beginning of Luke's Gospel, which is the third of the Gospels as we have them in the Christian Bibles. This is Luke writing. I'm just going to read out what's in front of you there. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seems good also to me to write an orderly account for you, these are my italics, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Luke is saying lots of stories about Jesus going around. So I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. I'm writing an orderly account so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Dawkins, since we mentioned him earlier, accuses Christianity of being based on blind faith. Luke is more or less telling Theophilus, I'm writing this gospel so you don't have blind faith. I want you to know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Now, and then he goes off into historical detail. Now, of course, you and I at this point of time cannot investigate as Luke investigated, but that is not Luke's fault. In other words, he did for his time all he could to show the public nature of what Christians believed. This is the testimony of the senses, this is what we saw and so forth. The fact that I can't check it all these millennia on doesn't mean to say that he wasn't, in his time, doing everything he could to pull the stops out, to show this actually is the basis for being Christian, these things. When Jesus is reported to have said, blessed are those people who believe, who haven't seen, what is meant is not the eyewitnesses are not important, it's rather that obviously the eyewitnesses will pass out after one generation. The rest of us, years on, are not going to be eyewitnesses. So if we have faith, it's not blind faith. It is a conviction that what the eyewitnesses saw, claimed to have seen, actually they did see. In other words, we trust, for whatever reason, we trust the reliability of those witnesses. Now, you might or might not be convinced by that. That's not my concern. My concern is to show how it was that early Christianity sets about its credentials. It's actually important for it to have eyewitnesses. The same thing will be found when Paul writes to the Corinthians in the 15th chapter of the first letter of the Corinthians, where Paul is talking about the resurrection of Jesus. He said, well, look, there are plenty of people who are still around. Ask them. I can't ask them all those years on, but other people could in those days. In an epistle written in the mid-50s, we don't know when Jesus died, but the epistle was written within a generation of his death. That we can be pretty sure of. And Paul is saying, check these things with people who are around now. It's very striking, the public nature of this kind of testimony. So, to put it in rather grand terms, C, the structure of theological epistemology, faith and reason in scriptures. It seems that the grounds of believing are empirical, that is to say, the testing of the senses. That doesn't take you all the way to faith. It doesn't take you all the way to faith. There is something separate going on when you come to personal faith, but there are grounds, there are reasons for believing there. Two, there's a background assumption that God exists, but the empirical data set out in the New Testament suggests that you might suspend that background assumption, say, I don't know if God exists or not, but nevertheless come to the conviction that God does exist on the basis of the very stuff they set out before you, what is a background assumption for them may become a conclusion for us. Much more can be said there. I don't mean to reduce faith to a rational process at all. I simply want to indicate that if you want to talk about reason, there's reason going on here. Let's leave it there for a moment. Now, Rodney, can I have until 12:05? Is that okay? Did I start 5 minutes late, or was that unfair?
Okay, we'll let you find out.
You sure?
Yeah.
Thank you. I am sorry about this.
No, that's fine.
Move quickly. I will move quickly. The question of natural theology, so we can discuss it at greater length in the discussion. I've talked about the Bible there in the New Testament, but in a scientific culture, this was raised in the discussion, do we need natural theology? I want to make 4 remarks. The first is, there's an important distinction, often not observed properly, between natural knowledge of God and natural theology. And natural knowledge of God is something which is known for whatever reason. And natural theology is an argument or a set of inferences. And you might defend the claim that God can be known naturally, that is, without a special revelation in Christ or the Bible or anything, that God can be known naturally. You might defend that claim without believing in natural theology, which is a studied inference and argument. Let me illustrate that with point B. Earlier on, Peter Harrison indicated us a text from Romans where Paul talks about the invisible things being behind the visible. God's eternal power and divine nature being clearly seen, understood from what he has made. If you look carefully at Paul, he's not there advancing natural theology. He's not saying by an inferential train of reasoning you can look at the world and conclude there's a God. Not by inference. He thinks there is an association, an intuitive association, for want of a better word. What is to be called the sensus divinitatis. There is a sense of God that people have as they look out at the heavens. Now, we may or may not judge that a good way of saying things, but that's what he's saying. He's not actually saying it's a logical extrapolation. Thirdly, what Paul actually assumes here is connection of moral and cosmic awareness. The kind of awareness he's talking about that people naturally have of God is also a moral awareness, an awareness of God as someone who can lay obligations upon us. Much contemporary debates about God and science omits that bit of it. I've been involved in discussions about whether God exists in natural theology, and the concept of God is like talking about Saturn or Pluto or something, or Jupiter. Does this object exist out there somewhere? Paul's not talking about that. There's a kind of moral apprehension along the cosmic. Fourthly, and I won't expand on this now, I want to just indicate that I think there's a potential and a limit to natural theology in the light of scientific cosmogony. That is the question of the origins of the universe, or the origins of whatever came before the universe. The potential is that, and I think I'll leave this at this point, because tomorrow we're looking at physics and faith anyway. The potential, obviously, is that as you ask fundamental questions about why anything should exist at all, then you can see how, for many people, to explain in terms of God is the most rational. If you're going to use rational as general wide sense that people often do, all right, God is the most rational explanation, many will think, of the existence of cosmos at all. I would be cautious. I'm not against this line of reasoning, but I'm cautious. I think there's a limit to it, because the God who exists out of that kind of understanding is not necessarily the Christian God. It is a deity or an intelligent force or something of that kind. And quite apart from logical issues surrounding, for example, the concepts of probability and the origins of the universe, quite apart from logical questions, the kind of deity you sometimes end up with can seem quite remote for me as a Christian, but I don't want to deny the place of that altogether. 5 issues, connections, faith and science. I'll be quick, and I will actually just touch on 2 or 3 of these, I think, apart from a quick mention. Firstly, a brief word, 12a, on creation, evolution, interpretation, Genesis text. I won't say anything about that. That's being dealt with by Ernest Lucas, I think it is, isn't it,
yeah.
on Thursday. So I simply will not comment on that at all, and it's taking me a lot of self-discipline to stop there. Secondly, a longer word, which will nevertheless be brief in accordance with my promise. I think that as we think about scientific causality in the light of the Christian belief in divine providence, we should remember the force of Jesus' observation. Observe the birds, your heavenly Father feeds them. Can you imagine someone saying, I've observed them. I'll tell you what happens. They build their nests, they feed their young, they gather their twigs. It's not God, it's a natural process. Was Jesus so stupid not to have known that? Jesus is saying, yeah, it's a natural process. That's how God does it. No collision at all. Providence and causality. Huge issues, of course, arise here in relation to evil, which demand separate treatment, which I'm not giving, but I think they're big ones. Thirdly, 12c, what is involved in the claim that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, what's interesting is that there's no conceptualization of the resurrection. No one actually witnesses the resurrection at all. And even when Jesus is alleged to have appeared and the descriptions of him given, they are descriptions, not conceptions. There's no conception of what the transformed body was like. It's simply, well, this is what we saw. Because these are ordinary people, and Christian faith is for ordinary people. It's not simply for a bunch of intellectuals who are capable of, have leisure to figure these things out. But obviously there's a claim both to miracle and life after death. Now, I'll say a quick word about miracle here. Interesting discussion we had earlier. You can define a miracle in terms of violation of the law of nature, or violation of laws of nature as we know them, or you can say there's no such thing as a law of nature, there are observed regularities, and miracles are a violation of those. What is interesting in the case of the New Testament is that there is no, this is my last little image, there is no definition of miracle at all. They simply say what they saw. Now, this man is a PhD student who has written the first century definitive treatise on water. He, I think it's a he, knows everything there is to be known about water, all the properties, has listed them. And to celebrate submitting the PhD the next day, he goes to a wedding in Cana in Galilee. And blow me down if someone doesn't turn water into wine. This is most inconvenient for thesis purposes, so he adds to the list of all the properties of water, P.S., just as time to put this in before submitting, water can also become wine. Supervisor sees this and says, something wrong here. It's not a property of water. But I saw it happen. It's not a property of water. Well, it's a power the water has. No, it's not a power the water has. What is it? Maybe it's a capacity water has under certain conditions. Maybe that's what we should say. So what we're really saying is, it's not a property of water to become wine as such. But in a world created by God, God is capable of creating a world which both has natural powers and natural properties, to call it that, and a world in which he can act in a supernatural way or special way upon everything he has created. So the water has the capacity to become wine when the power of God moves upon it in a specific way, but that's not intrinsic to the water. If you had to conceptualize it, you might do it somewhere like that. But what's interesting is in the New Testament, it's not conceptualized, it's simply described. Finally, the question of life after death, post-mortal survival, and resurrection body. The only point I'd make here, again, I don't have to say much about this because the brain has been discussed later in the week. Issues surrounding that might come up here. But if you study carefully the Christian scriptures, 1 Corinthians 15 again, you'll find that the emphasis Paul has is on the discontinuity between the present and the future. What we sow now, says Paul, is not of the body that is to come. It's not this assemblage of fleshly particles that's going to come together. It's a separate mode of existence. It reduces to the question of whether there's God powerful enough to do such a thing. 14 were Pascal and Locke right, and not altogether. I think they assumed a kind of rational neutrality, probably, but they're right in two important points. I think it's important in our debate to remember these. The limits of reason are inherent to reason. Secondly, it is proper for us, if we're talking scientifically about religious belief at all, to talk about historical science, not simply natural science. Very often people simply bracket off the important questions of history and historical science, and yet precisely Christianity belongs to the sphere of history. I don't think I need to add any concluding observations on science, faith, and reason today. Thanks for your patience in letting me extend a little bit.
Good. Well, we do have some time for questions.
I'm thinking about the situation when a statement of science is just contradicting something from religion, a statement of religion. For instance, Wittgenstein, in his writings about religion, says that in this situation, for a religious believer, he will always accept what his faith is saying. How would you approach this in your account of faith and reason? He says that it's in the nature of a believer to accept what his faith is saying, although he accepts that it's a proof of science against his statement.
Yes.
So he accepts the proof as being valid,
Yeah.
although he states the faith.
Yes, thank you for that. I happen to be very partial to the philosophy of Wittgenstein, but don't agree with him in everything, and not on that particular point. For one thing, I don't like this word religion, so I want to hear what statements we are talking about. I want examples. But in Christian perspective, and reason can be given for being Christian, not a proof, but reason. In Christian perspective, the statements actually cannot collide, because the one God is the one who made the world, and therefore anything we truly find out about the world is truly found out about the creation of God himself. And there will not be statements actually of religion, as in Christian religion, that can contradict that. That sounds like an a priori, but it's not strictly an a priori. As a matter of fact, it is the inference we draw from any Christian belief. If the one God, we heard earlier about two books, the book of nature, the book of scripture. If the one God is the author of both, and by author scripture, I don't mean certain views of scripture which you might be attributing to me when I use that phrase. I think it has to be interpreted properly. If the one God is the author of both scripture and nature, then a true statement, scientific statement, and a true religious statement cannot actually collide. So one have to have examples, and then give me an example, and I'll try to show you why they don't collide.
But it's not the idea of having true statements of religion. It's just like a matter of evidence for something, and you take the scientific evidence being strong there, and you accept it. It's hard to give the truth of something, because it depends on the context of the theory, in a sense.
Uh-huh.
And if I accept what you say,
Yeah.
I still ask, what's in your opinion the distinction, the difference between faith and science, or something similar with it? Is there an essential difference, or it's just a matter of a difference in grace of relying on reason? Because at one point, as a believer, you just accept some limits of reason, or is something different, an essential difference between two?
I think you can talk about an essential difference, but that does not entail that the conclusions will collide. Some have discussed in Christian theology, this is not characteristic of Judaism, and I must suspend judgment on Islam for a moment, for a second. But some have argued in Christian theology that theology is a science. It is strictly a science. Because it deals with God's revelation of himself, and there's an objectivity to that, and we can study it objectively. But that does not mean to say, now I myself would be hesitant, by the way, to use the word science or theology, but some have said that. But even when people say that, they say it is not scientific in exactly the same way as natural science is scientific. Different, if you want to talk about evidences are different kinds. And let's hear, forget religion for a second. What is the evidence that someone hates you, or loves you, or is proud? Well, you might say, you can't have an infallible knowledge there. I don't know this person hates or loves. I can't be sure this person really is proud. But, you know, I say frustratedly, sort of not knowing much about epistemology, I say, I do kind of know that. I mean, I have knowledge of that realm of things, but it's not scientific. I have some sort of evidence. It's not evidence in the sense that it can be mathematically demonstrable, but yes, there is. In fact, I might get stronger and stronger as I go along and say, yes, hang on, I have evidence of the heart here. Why should these things be simply scientific evidences? So faith and science, if I transpose that example to the realm of faith for a moment, faith and science might have the evidences which are peculiar to them and not collide, but not be the same. Furthermore, I want to emphasize two things. One is in relation to one of your comments there. It's not faith setting a limit to reason. I regularly ask people in debates, regular debates with atheists, I regularly ask them why rationally they believe what they believe. And I think they hit the limits quite quickly as far as I'm concerned. Further, I think that, as I tried to indicate in the New Testament, faith can draw on board certain reasons, not conclusive proofs. I do realize you're asking a bigger question that I'm giving a satisfactory answer to. I'm sorry that my answer is limited, but the best I can do probably in this time.
Just put a bit in there.
Yeah.
When you're talking about bringing reasons to bear, such as the eyewitness testimony and so on,
Yeah.
then in a sense it seems to me that you're doing natural theology. You're bringing argument, reason to bear. And indeed those arguments about testimony are given more strength if we have some reason to believe that God exists in the first place, which might come from the more classical types of argument.
I accept that some would think that I'm coming too close, for those who are unhappy with natural theology, but I think, Rodney, a distinction still holds in that in natural theology, we start from features normally, don't we, which are sort of universally accessible.
Indeed.
The cosmos, or the so-called design of cosmos, or moral awareness. Here what I'm doing is asking how Christian scriptures themselves present to us the reasons they give for their own beliefs, which to some might say, well, that's a different sort of thing. There's still reasons.
Public evidence, and quoting Luke and so on.
That's right. They gave public evidence in their time.
Yeah.
It was public for them to some extent. It doesn't take them all the way to actual living faith, but that's true. I think it's somewhere between, as it were, a natural theology and a dogmatic statement, I believe, on the authority of the Bible, and that's it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Samson, I think you go next.
Thank you. I want to just chip in some contribution on what John Pokemon says on the relationship of faith and science.
Yeah.
And there is this sense of faith in science. And the scientists will have to believe that I can do certain things, and if you do it this way, with what we've seen, it's going to happen this way. It talks about some element of faith in pursuing a particular goal in science. And two, opinions, which is often seen to be from the religious angle. The religion often talks about opinions. He also shipping that in science, there are not all theories, there are opinions. That, for instance, there could be lots of tests for a particular patient in the hospital, and probably the medical doctors are not really, will not confirm what it is, that they go on best educated guess.
Yes.
It's still opinion at the end of the day. but just being helped with scientific discoveries. So there are cases where we have faith in science, opinions in religion and in science. And but the real problem that I also have, as you do, is about natural theology, originating, and I will always say that the self-natural theology is redefined away from what people like William Halley, even Ayala will say. I would not agree that we should rejuvenate natural theology because being heavily influenced by Calvin, and Calvin does not necessarily be a natural theologian. And he used science as a contest for his theology. And he did pretty well, preaching about Christ and biblical issues.
Thank you. Let me make observations on both of those things. Firstly, while I agree with you, of course, and everybody would, that opinion has a place in science, I myself am wary of aligning scientific opinion and religious opinion too closely, or making the place of faith in science and the place of faith in religion, Christian religion here, to be the same sorts of thing. I think they're different things. Again, Locke makes this point. Locke talks about the way if you proceed rationally and scientifically, you might, he thinks, demonstrate certain things. But for the most part, even in rational and scientific matters, said Locke, you get no higher than probability. And where you have probability, there must be a measure of faith for you to assent or affirm to something. But that faith is the product of rational thought. So when scientists come up with an opinion, ideally, it is still the result of having followed scientific procedures. It's simply that they cannot, in that case, follow them right through to their demonstrative conclusion. The opinion, in other words, and certainty in science are, broadly speaking, within the terms of a question, I know there are bigger issues here, broadly speaking, products of the same method. Whereas in religion, it could be argued, when faith and opinion enters into religion, it enters in from the beginning. I mean, there are no demonstrations at all possible here. It's a different kind of animal in religion to have faith and opinion. And that is the objection some will bring. So I think I want to do justice to that to some extent. I do think that the function of faith in Christian religion and in science, I think they operate a bit differently. And I think opinion operates a bit differently, even though I grant you there is opinion in science. By all means, come back to me if there's time. Secondly, natural theology. Well, I could comment on Calvin in particular. Maybe that's best done in personal discussion afterwards, but I'm very familiar, of course, with Calvin's thought on that. I do think, in light of Peter Harrison's presentation this morning, let me say it in that context, I do think there was an excessive reliance in the 17th century on natural theology. So that once you began to question some of the conclusions that were being arrived at in natural theology, then the credibility of Christianity itself began to be questioned. I actually don't think the credibility of Christianity was ever built on a natural theology. Natural theology can be supplementary, it can be supportive, put it broadly like that. But I agree with you, and Calvin would have said that as a matter of fact, our conviction about Christianity does not depend on this pretty sophisticated chain of influences which natural theology turns out to be. Well, maybe we'll hear more from that. Are you speaking tomorrow, Rodney? Or you're not? Let Rodney on this.
We'll come in with John, I'm sure. John,
yes, I'm sorry we'll miss Rodney on this tomorrow because I heard him in Dublin on this.
More questions at the back.
I'm imagining right now trying to explain, like if you're trying to explain the Christian faith to someone who's a complete atheist, and I think I wouldn't have too hard of a time explaining through general revelation, at least giving some rational explanation why there is some creator, and they would accept those arguments as having some appeal to reason. But then I think if I continued on and described why Christians believe the New Testament and appealed to reason to say that we can look for credentials of the witnesses that they would probably say, no, that's faith, because the only people who support those credentials are other Christians, and so that's not really a true appeal to reason. And I'm wondering, do you have anything, maybe other historical accounts from the same time period from non-Christians who would give credentials to the Christian writers that might be more satisfying for someone to actually believe that that's a true appeal to reason?
Right. What do you say from the same time period, from the 1st century roughly?
Yeah, roughly.
CE. We can't get very far, I think, from stuff external to Scripture in the 1st century. It might show us that Jesus indeed existed, that Jesus was worshipped by a community of people. But there's nothing outside the Bible that could be taken to be strongly corroborative of the particulars in the Bible itself. And that's in the nature of the case, in a way. The biblical writers were trying to give witness to the reason they believed certain things. I myself think that atheists, often, not always, because the more I've talked to the atheists, the more I've discovered the great variety amongst them. But I think they often, but not always, have really missed the big atheistic critiques of religion. I'm thinking of Marx, and I'm thinking Nietzsche, and I'm thinking of Freud, who actually have this merit, I think, in their different ways, of showing that our thought is rooted much less in rational factors than it is in a whole host of other factors. They all explain in different ways, of course, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. And I do try to persuade people very often that all of us, I don't exempt religious believers, I say all of us very often have an interest in thinking a certain way, in coming to certain conclusions. So that let's not pretend to a rational neutrality here. Having said that, then you try to go as far as you can on the rational side. But I don't think that there is corroborative evidence from outside scriptures that is strong. But what one has to ask with the scriptures is, as you'd have to ask of any religion, Buddhism in any of its forms, Islam, etc., what you have is a phenomenon, the New Testament. No one disagrees there's a New Testament there. What eventually explains the emergence of that phenomenon? How do you account for it? And when I press people for their account as atheists, I ask why that is more credible than my account. I mean, I'm not simply believing what the Bible says. Are they simply disbelieving what the Bible says? I mean, there's a whole host of things to be worked through there.
Yes, 1, 2, 3. Okay, yes.
Yeah, no, I'm just kind of pondering on asking the question. You're talking about reasons for believing in the New Testament, the accounts of the ministry, the miracles, and the resurrection of Jesus.
Yes.
With regards to the resurrection, the so-called eyewitness testimony that was being handed down before it was written in the Gospels. And I think you're saying that that's relatively a good reason to believe that these accounts are true. But then, of course, we have to look at the psychology of eyewitness testimony itself, which is known to be completely and, well, not completely, very, very unreliable. We have the phenomenon of false memory syndrome,
yes,
where people genuinely believe that we've experienced something traumatic, but which in fact did not happen at all.
Yeah.
The most notable example being people in therapy believing that they were the victims of childhood sexual abuse by their own parents and stood up against them in court and convicted them. It seems so amazing, unbelievable that it could hardly be true, and yet it's happened to thousands of innocent people, particularly in America. We have also the phenomenon of grief hallucinations, which are sensory perceptions of the deceased but which are not real, occur amongst otherwise psychologically healthy people, usually perceived to be comforting. There was a study recently done that showed that 80% of elderly people experience grief hallucinations 1 month after bereavement. Both the intensity of the grief and the degree of closeness to the deceased predicted the number of grief hallucinations experienced. Some people might argue that what appear to be hallucinations aren't hallucinations at all, but are genuine perceptions of the spirit of the deceased. Well, such an explanation is unlikely to be true, given that people, when they mistakenly believe that their loved one has died, nevertheless experience great hallucinations. And we have a whole other variety of psychological phenomena, such as group dynamics and how people come to beliefs that they do. I mean, you factor in all these explanations into why the early Christians believed that the resurrection actually happened. I think we've got better explanation that actually it didn't happen than the mere belief that it did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for that, because it enables me to clarify something which perhaps I should have made clear earlier. Because I'm aware that what I said in that point could be heard as, here I am standing up giving reasons why I'm a Christian. I wasn't quite doing that. I am a Christian, but I didn't see it as my job to give reasons why I was a Christian in this particular context. Rather, I was trying to ask, in terms of the New Testament itself, how does it present its data to us? Because the assumption many people have is that religious people just sort of blind faith, primitive, all this kind of stuff. Now, what I'm trying to do is to lay bare the structure of that witness. You can then ask all the questions you have asked and have been asked for a long time. It's quite right and appropriate to discuss all those things. But I think, first of all, we've got to draw people's attention to the fact that there is an attempt in the documents themselves, whether or not they got it right, an attempt actually to ground their testimony in senses, in investigation, in sort of a public knowledge being given, all those things. So I'm grateful to you for that, because I was not quite trying to say you should believe it. I was trying to say rather, this is what Christianity actually looks like. It's not simply a mythological faith stuff of that kind.
Thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned theology as a science. Since you're a systematic theologian, maybe you could give a professional opinion on the modern attempts to do theology as a science, like in Lonergan, or to come back to Scotsman Torrance, or maybe modern experimental pastoral theology, doing experiments on with people.
Right, I will try to do that. I think that the ambition and motivation of those who want to make theology science is one I can go along with. That is, I do believe myself that there is God and that God has spoken to us through Christ. So that is my belief, for which I'm happy to give some reasons as far as they can take us, of course. Inasmuch as those who talk of theology as a science want to highlight the objectivity of our religious knowledge, I have sympathy. Inasmuch as people who want to talk about theology as a science want to show the positive interactions between natural science. Of course, we ought to be talking about things like psychology as well here, the scientific state of that. But let's say natural science and Christian faith. Inasmuch as they want to talk about those interactions, I have sympathy as well. But I would not myself call theology a science, because I think that the problems in Christian theology have often arisen both on particular doctrinal points and in terms of the philosophy of theology as well, because Christianity has departed too far from its Jewish roots. And in terms of the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament, the way in which God is known is not scientific. And there's a limit to how far you can get with a scientific elaboration of it. You construct scientific theories for and within theology, and you become quite vulnerable, I think. So I have a reservation about thinking theology exactly as a science. And one thing that is omitted so often in those accounts is the reality of evil. I think evil threatens to make nonsense of Christian belief and religious belief, though of every other belief as well. And evil is a scar that runs through everything. And I'm not happy simply to talk about scientific realities within theology, theological realities, given the big black hole which is evil, which is advertised in the Bible itself as a big black hole. Evil is the nemesis of a certain kind of systematization and scientificness of theology, I believe.
Thank you. So Dennis had a question. I think this would need to be the last one of the...
Oh, I was just a very brief comment. So it's coming back to the whole discussion about evidence and history. I mean, I think where there are similarities between science and faith, it seems to me, as coming from the science side, is a couple of things. One is the contingency side that Peter brought out, I think, last time, that all history is contingent. All scientific experiments are contingent as well. Not science itself, but actual doing scientific experiments.
Mhm.
And secondly, the belief in scientific experiments is entirely dependent on eyewitnesses. I mean, that's why we have lab notebooks, which some people like myself just sign off at the end of every day, because there's a record of witnesses who have given account of what they saw and did. So in that sense, I think there's quite a lot of similarity between, you know, there are certain interesting parallels there, I think, between contingency and witness statements. I think there's a lot of similarity in historical investigation and scientific investigation.
Interestingly enough, John Polkinghorne talks about the Bible as being more like a lab notebook than being like a systematic theology.
Yes, I grant parallels, of course, but I think I'm wary as well, because at the end of the day, Christian faith does not arise in the human heart as a result of the sum total, as it were, of rational steps. There is something of a different order involved here. And this is where Pascal is perennially valuable, I think. Pascal picked out the fact that there are factors which go into Christian believing, which cannot be strictly paralleled in scientific endeavors. I mean, after all, this is a huge existential issue. The question of whether there is God or whether there is Christ or what Christ has done with the human race, those actually command, if I take them seriously, my attention as a person, whether I reject or accept them. They command the whole person in a way in which the logging up testimony does not, I think. So I think I might go along with you to some extent, but I wouldn't want to push too hard the parallels myself.